Tonight's lecture, Beneath the Streets of Boston, Building America's First Subway. We do have books for sale, and along with the book sale, you also get this beautiful image of Tremont Street, Boston, 1895. And Joe will do signing at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So a little bit about our lecture this evening. Beneath the Streets of Boston, Building America's First Subway. Our speaker is Joe McHenry. He's a painter and illustrator whose work has appeared in over 100 publications worldwide, including the New York Times, the London Times, Vanity Fair, and Esquire. His books, Beneath the Streets of Boston, Building America's First Subway, and One Times Square, A Century of Change at the Crossroads of the World, chronicle a history of their subjects in a way that is accessible to both children and adults. A native majored in Mass, McHenry was awarded a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. He teaches painting and illustration at RISD, lives in Brookline with his wife and I think 3 children that are here. Thank you. And Brookline Adult and Community Education is proud to welcome Joe McHenry to our Brookline Distinguished Lecture Series. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. So I guess we're going to keep the lights on, right, for the cameras?
It's very dark.
Okay. So I like being in this classroom. It's kind of cool.
Is that too loud?
No, well, I don't know. I think it's okay for me.
Is everyone okay?
You guys. Okay. So I brought some original artwork with me. I brought some of these mock-up books that I did. So I kind of wanted to share a little bit about the history of the subway, but also about how I go about making the book, and primarily an illustrator. So I'll say I'll go into the subway, the history of the subway, why it was built, how it was built, and all that kind of stuff, and construction techniques. But I thought before I started, I would.
Sorry, we're gonna turn.
That's better. Okay. Okay. I'll share a little bit about what I do on a day-to-day basis, just to. So this is a Thanksgiving issue of Bon Appetit. So day-to-day, as I teach at RISD, I do a class, and watercolor class in the fall, and then an illustration class in winter session. But day-to-day, I'm just doing this kind of stuff: magazine illustration. I do Reader's Digest every month. Just a bunch of magazines. So I ended up doing a lot of how-to. I think the subway book, I was really interested in how it was built, and I guess the way my mind works, I just like to do how-to things. This is for Wired magazine, just a feature on kitchen gadgets. And a lot of times, like with Bon Appetit, they have a kitchen in their magazine offices, and they'll send me photos of things. And then with Wired, they'll usually send me photos of, sometimes I'm kind of cutting and pasting, moving things around. So I tend to build my compositions with Photoshop. So this is a portrait of John Podesta that I did for the National Journal. He's now running the Hillary for President campaign, and he worked for Obama and for Bill Clinton. So they wanted me to do a portrait of him, but I couldn't get into the White House, unfortunately, to have him sit for me. So this is a bit of how I kind of compose that's my favorite Ames chair that I have at home. I figured he might have one at the White House. But I found a picture of a globe that I found online. I cut pasted. I found the curtains that they have in the White House. I found a room, like the window they have in the White House, and stuff in the background. So I had to kind of imagine Podesta in his office using, fortunately we have a similar body type, I guess. But this is kind of how I make portraits. Also, if I'm doing a portrait of somebody, I can't just take a photographer's work and copy it. So I'm always kind of cutting and pasting, making changes, and flipping people and moving their hair and that kind of stuff. Speaking of hair, I've done, yeah. So I get to have fun too. I've been doing Trump drawings for a long time. Vanity Fair editor-in-chief Graydon Carter hates Trump, and he's hated him for 30 years, and so I've been fortunate enough to be given a lot of jobs on Trump. So that's Trump over on the right. I did a bunch of these. There's a lot of them. I think that was Paul Simon on the top right. I did Jim Cramer from Mad Money. That one's not here. This is a Jim Tavener, who's a British composer, and then here he is. And this is my second book, One Times Square. I tend I tend to kind of focus on the passage of time in my books, and so one of my colleagues from archaeological past, Teresa's here. I did some archaeological work in Tuscany for a while. I've always been into history, old stuff, and how. And so the subway is kind of the same way, going through the tunnels and imagining, people going through 100 years ago. The Times Square book covers Times Square from when there were dirt roads, horses, that kind of thing. But you think about Times Square now, it's the most modern place I could think of, and I really wanted to show when it wasn't modern, where it was dirt and horses and that kind of thing. So I graduated from RISD in '94. I spent a lot of time bouncing around, working in coffee shops, bookstores, restaurants. Then I got into murals. I did work for theaters, painting sets, that kind of stuff. But it was all in the Boston area. I lived in Somerville, Brighton, so I was always on the T. And I knew I wanted to do a book. I wanted to take a subject and control the whole thing from writing and research and illustration and have that my own sort of labor of love. So Boston's a historical place. You think of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. The first subway in America, I felt like it was a bit of unsung history, and I felt like that could be a good subject. Also, it had cool things that, construction and underground stuff that interested me. So these are the panels that I'm sure everyone's seen at Park Street that really got me interested in thinking about it as a subject. So then, from the germ of the idea to publication was 8 years. So it was a really, really slow process. I didn't know what I was doing. It was my first book. My second book took 6. I'm hoping this next one doesn't take as long, but it probably will. But what it allows me to do is, research and, I'm doing other things. Right now I have a pretty busy illustration career as well, so the books are kind of in between. But here's me sort of building things up, doing some sketches, seeing how that feels, writing some text out, cutting, pasting it. And I was doing this, and she's probably before Photoshop, so I would spend a lot of time in Kinko's copying and pasting things.
You know the oldest subway in the world, right?
London. Yeah. I get into that a little bit in a bit. I will get into that stuff too. So talking about research, these are, I pulled these out if you want to look through those as well. The title, that came along later. But this, I noticed this today. I was putting it together. These guys are riveting the steel together, and I have the guy tossing the hot rivet, and the other guy's catching the hot rivet with the same things. That would have been really hard if they didn't do it that way. But that's kind of imagining how they put it together. Then I could do the research and then find out that's not the way it was done, and have to put the proper stuff in. So, to the history. Why was the subway built? This shows Tremont Street in 1895. That's on a poster. It's also in the book. In about the mid-1850s, 1860s, Boston's population exploded. Everyone knows about the Irish, Italians, immigrants coming in from all over. As people came into Boston, the suburbs got built up. So they called them the streetcar suburbs, because you got there by streetcar. So, Somerville, Arlington, Medford, and then areas south. So as the streetcars came in, the trolleys came in, they tended to go on the straight thoroughfares. New York's streets are gridded out logically, and Boston's streets are famously windy, based on the cow paths that were there. This is how the story goes. So as they came into the city, Tremont Street got really, really crowded, and it got to the point where people said it was faster to travel by getting out of your trolley and walking across the rooftops of the jammed up trolleys to get to your destination. So in the mid-1890s, the Boston Transit Commission was formed to study the traffic problem, and come up with a solution. And this was one of the early solutions. For a while, this was what was going to be put into Boston. It was called the Meigs Elevated Monorail System. And it wasn't built because it was steam powered, and it billowed thick black smoke, and the monorail thing wasn't as proven as in New York. They've been using elevated railway since the 1860s, I think. So, but this is a test track in East Cambridge that was built, and here's an illustration of what it would have looked like on Washington Street. So it was seriously considered. So the Boston Transit Commission eventually said, okay, we want to, their recommendation was to build a series of elevated lines and then a subway line below Tremont Street. And there was a vote that was happening in the city of Boston on whether this bill would pass. So the Boston Post was against this, and they had this really entertaining series of cartoons to try to get people to vote against the bill. So basically, some people didn't like the elevated because it was going to block all the sunlight. Some people didn't like the subway because there's fear of underground travel, you know, thinking about death and disease, and the air wasn't sanitary. So it says it's very dangerous hot weather experiment to indulge in subway ale and elevated whiskey at one and the same time. This one is Miss Boston in the middle, being wooed by two men, the subway and the elevated. And it says, they're pestering Miss Boston with their attentions, and curiously enough, she can't accept one without the other, and that would be decidedly awkward. Then you better decline them both, Miss Boston, tomorrow. This is my favorite. Boston is congested. He's a congested patient. And he's being treated by Dr. Elevated and Dr. Subway. Subway Matthews is the mayor of Boston. And it says, these doctors had a very violent quarrel as to which of their prescriptions is the better. Finally, they compromised by deciding to give the patient both courses of treatment. This may be fun for the doctors, but it is mighty rough on the patient. We hope he will refuse to be dosed in this way today. So that came out the morning of the vote. It did pass by short numbers. I think it was 15,000 something to 14,000 something. So once the vote passed, construction went forward on the subway. So as the subway was built, it was built, when I was doing the book, I was trying to figure out where do I start, where do I stop? And I decided that we would make it clean and neat by doing 4 chapters, the green, orange, blue, and red line, which didn't come about until later. I'm actually curious if anyone knows what the colors stand for. You have a T-shirt on. You should probably
Yes,
know, right?
I have your book even.
Oh, okay.
The green for the emerald necklace.
Right.
The orange one below Washington,
Yeah.
which used to be called Orange Street. The blue goes underwater, and red for Harvard's color, which is crimson.
He's awesome. So if you heard that, that's great. So, wow, you've read every word too. So, beyond the 4 lines, I also wanted to get into a different construction method for each, and there were some methods that kind of crossed over. The cut and cover was used on a lot, but I'll talk a bit about each of the lines and the construction method. But the green line was majority cut and cover, and I'll talk about that. The orange line, as you mentioned, went through a section of Boston. Washington Street at one time was called Orange Street. The South End was, I think part of that was called Orange. The blue line underwater, the red line is a deep bored tunnel. That's the deepest part of the subway beneath Beacon Hill. Okay, so when you hear the subway opened in 1897, that was just a really small section from Park Street to, there was an entrance on the public garden between Boylston and Arlington. So with trolleys, wasn't, the subway cars you have today, it was the street trolleys would just come and dip down into the subway. They would come into Park Street for, in just 1897, loop around and then go back out. And then the following year, the Pleasant Street entrance is in if anyone knows the Church of All Nations in Bay Village near the South End. Wherever that church is, there was an entrance. And this tunnel, if you're at Boylston, you can see that tunnel, it's still there. It's just been unused. And then this Adams Square, the station is no longer in use. That's below City Hall. And I've been told that there's a door in City Hall that opens to this old abandoned station. I've never seen it, but I've heard that it's there. So one of the biggest challenges of building the subway in the city was the mess of all the pipes. So the gas, water, sewer, all that kind of stuff. They all had to be shut down. You can imagine what a mess it would be to just stop those, reroute them. That's the basic cut and cover method. And all these images, all the paintings in the book are watercolored with sepia watercolor made to, I purposely picked the sepia to look like the old photos. And these are my illustrations, but I based them on information from books published by the Boston Transit Commission. So I would go to the Boston Transit Library, where they had all these old books, and they have great information about how many cubic yards of earth was removed and everything about how it was built. So basically, cutting a trench, putting walls up with wood, and then you put in some steel, some concrete walls, the brick arches. If you're at Park Street and you look up, you can see in between each steel beam there's a brick arch. Still there, still functioning after 120 years. And then covered over, and then the road is covered above that. So that's cut and cover. Everything was done by hand except the one machinery, a bit of machinery they had were these steam-powered engines that they used mostly to haul dirt out of the tunnel. So here's how the trenches were built. Built a trench, built the wood, and then they put tracks above the wood lattice, and then they're these wooden cranes that they pushed along, and then here, they're using the steam-powered crane to lift and take the dirt out, which would be dumped in these earth carts, which would then be, most of them I think went to North Station. There was a place where they took the dirt down on the tracks and then to North Station on a sort of a bridge, and then they dumped it into trains, and then it was carted away. Some of the earth was used to even out parts of the Boston Common, and I think specifically where the baseball field is, right near the public garden. So this was fun. I like this part. It's good to have some gruesome stuff in the book. So as they were going through, you go through from Park to Boylston, that's just going through the Common. There was a lot of opposition to digging in the Common. But here they go through, there's the Common burial ground, and they mostly built in front of it, so they were not going right through the thing. But there were 6 gravestones that had to be, so there were 6 bodies that had to be reinterred, they figured, during the construction of this. But they ran into 900 bodies. There were 900 bodies as they were building it. And actually, from doing these talks, I heard somebody say that there was a plague at some point, and they did a mass burial in this thing, but it was all unmarked. So in any case, they took. I gotta get to this part. So a lot of people were nervous about the idea of underground travel. So the first subway was London, 1890, and they were actually steam powered. So if you can imagine going a steam powered tunnel with all the smoke and how dirty that must have been. And then Budapest and Glasgow built subways before Boston, but it was, I think, 1896, I think, for both of them. But at the time, they hadn't been built, so it was only London. So people were thinking about, burial, and, underground was for burial. There was no underground travel. So the Boston Post was kind of like the Fox 25 News of the time. And after this, going through here, they published this in the paper and said that if you magnetize the air 10,000 times, you would see that. This is, I actually took this picture yesterday, and it's in the central burying ground, and they took all the bodies and put them in there. Or I guess, I don't know how 900, the bones of 900 individuals fit, I don't know how big it is, but that marker's there. So if you could see, where's that piano alley? Isn't there like a Steinway store over here or something? It's right around there. So they painted everything white. They wanted it to be as welcoming as possible. So everything was painted. It was really well lit. All the stations were white ceramic tile. It was mahogany. They cleaned everything. They really wanted this to be a success. So they wanted to allay the fears of the public. This is Park Street Station, one of the kiosks being built, and the stone came from New Hampshire. Granite came from New Hampshire. And here's a painting of the first car I went through September 1st, 1897. So a lot of people say, okay, these look like photographs. But I try to, as an artist, I want to just point out a few things that they're watercolors. So I like to keep a few areas that look loose. They're not like hyper detailed with a size 0 brush. So some of the loose edges. And here's some of the newspaper clippings from the day after. Subway success, popular with the people. This may not have been the Boston Post that published this. But actually they show, actually kind of this, the cars were open too, which is odd to think about. And you could go through the subway, hang out, and maybe hit the wall with your hand. That wouldn't be allowed now. And I like this, when you're in the subway and the subway comes and you feel that rush of air. That we're used to it, but that was, Dame Boston's first impression of rapid transit. So, as I was showing with the John Podesta portrait, sometimes I need to do a picture of something. I can't do it right from a photograph. I kind of have to invent it. So, I really wanted each chapter to have a map showing what's been done. So, the first chapter is the green line, so that's been done. And then in dark is what this next chapter is about, and the next line of the subway to be built, in this case the elevated railway. I wanted to find photographs of the Boston Transit Commission working, but they didn't exist. I couldn't find them. I really wanted to show the Boston Transit Commission people. So that's my father-in-law on the right. And he said, "You made me fat, too big." And that's John Singer Sargent on the left. I'm a huge fan of his work. So, stretching the truth a little bit, I guess, but it's, within reason, I suppose. If I did changes within a book, I tried to be as historically accurate as I could, because I didn't, I did have to make a few changes, but I was really conscious to try to not make anything inaccurate. So the elevated railway section was from Dudley Square in Roxbury to Sullivan Square in Charlestown, and then it went along Atlantic Ave, and then this is where it entered in the south end. There was an entrance that went through and then went into the Tremont Street Tunnel, and then back out at North Station. So here's my illustration that's supposed to depict, just like the Tremont Street 1895, the illustration was meant to show how busy it was, and so there's a lot of trolleys in that picture. But this is a sort of a cut and paste image of Atlantic Ave. So I found a bunch of pictures of Atlantic Ave. Some were busy, some were not from the angle I wanted, but basically took a bunch of those elements and put them together to show, you had all the wharves along the waterfront and all kinds of stores and things, so you would have various traffic along there, and that is one of the main thoroughfares as well, so that got really, really cramped. Talking about safety too, with the open cars, also these guys are, standing right under the construction. I guess they had a lot of faith in those chains and ropes. But, the way the elevated was built, as I mentioned, New York City had built the elevated. If anyone's been to the High Line, that. But I think they started their elevated system in the 1860s with steam-powered trains. So it's basically the same system they use there. But they would put the vertical elements in place first, and then hoist these horizontal elements into place. Then when that was together, they would then build the section in the middle, put tracks on it, and then just like as they did with the trench, there was a wooden crane that was just rolled along. So with the trench, you're rolling that crane along, taking the dirt out, moving it. So with this, you're building the L, then rolling this thing along, building the next section, rolling it, building the next section. So here's the correct way that the rivets went in. There were millions and millions of rivets in the structure, but all these little paint dots are, the rivets in there. Basically, they would get the rivet red hot and then put it through as it was hot, and then hammer the end while the metal was still malleable. So this guy is cranking a bellows that blows air on the coals to get the coal really, really hot. He's got his rivet in here. This guy has a tin bucket, so it's a little easier to catch it in. So he tosses it to him, we catch it in the tin bucket, then he would pull it out of the bucket, give it to these guys. One guy would hold this end, and the other guy would hammer it with a rounded hammer and finish the thing off. And then all the wooden ties were bolted down by hand. This is the most interesting part, and I was actually just trying to brush up on research and saw, I think it was on the Wikipedia page, that the Charlestown Bridge is going to be replaced starting 2017. So I think it's a maybe 3-year project, so get down to look at it while you can. So the Charlestown Bridge goes between North Station and Charlestown. At the time, there were a lot of businesses and wharves along the Charles, so boats needed to pass back and forth. So the bridge was designed so it could spin in the middle. There were 2 lanes in the middle for trolleys, and then above that there were 2 lanes for the L, and then there's 2 lanes for traffic here, 2 lanes for traffic on the other side as well. The cutaway, it's a little bit blown out here, but you can see all the wooden piles that are creating a foundation. So basically what they did was built a cofferdam and would pump out the water and then just pound these pilings in. There were spruce piles, I guess telephone pole size things. That is from one of the books, the Boston Trans-Commission book. They had great photographs in there and cool details. So they built this whole wooden timbering thing that was for the center section that housed the mechanism, or held the mechanism to spin the bridge. And that's part of the turntable that turned the whole center span. Hoisting the beams into place. And there's the illustration of Atlantic Ave after, which has magically been cleared of traffic. But both the elevated and the subway did, I'm kind of exaggerating with the illustrations, but I'm actually not exaggerating. They did, from all the accounts I read, I went to the newspapers, and it was kind of fun researching with the newspapers, but they really did clear traffic off. Tremont Street subway took a ton of traffic off Tremont Street, immediately cleared it. People loved it. They loved the subway. They were happy with being in there and the welcoming atmosphere. And with the L2, it's just all the trolleys that were previously on the street are just off. So it just made a ton more room for everyone else to move around.
Were they paid for by Boston?
It was paid for by it was privately funded. The subway and the L were privately funded by the Boston Elevated Railway Company. So that, actually you can see, it's really hard to see, but it says Boston Elevated Railway on here. But if you've been to Boylston Street, you've seen, does anyone recognize that? It's kind of this sort of shoved in the corner. There's better ones in kind of Kennebunk, Maine. It's preserved some.
It was also privately operated?
Okay, so my understanding is the Boston Transit Commission, I'm not great with the funding stuff, but the Boston Transit Commission paid for it. Boston Transit Commission oversaw the construction. The Boston Elevated Railway Company paid for it, and they received the money from the fares. But the tunnels were the property of the city of Boston. So it was paid for by this private company, and they got all the income for however many years the lease was for. And yeah, and then but the tunnels themselves were the property of the city. The stations were beautiful, I think, designed by Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow, who was the nephew of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. That's Sullivan Square Station, and I believe at the time it was the biggest trolley terminal in the world. There were 2 floors. I think there were maybe 11, I'm going to say 10 or 11. You've read the book. Probably know the information better than me at this point, but the elevated was in the middle. And so basically there were the Sullivan Square serviced the North Shore towns like, Medford, Arlington. Trolleys would come in, people get off the trolley and hop onto the L and then scoot into downtown Boston.
Were these all electrified?
Yes, so the L the elevateds had a third rail, and the subway had a wire up top. But the trolleys were, all the city's trolleys were electrified in 1889, but before that they were horse-drawn. I think the last horse-drawn was 1905, so up till 1905 there were some horses pulling trolleys still. That's my father-in-law on the right, this time a little slimmer, and then with a mustache, so he's disguised. And the guy on the left is this guy, Heinrich, who I saw in a play in Providence, who was a friend of a friend, and he just had a cool look, and I asked to photograph him. I just like his face, it's just cool. Oh, so, the third chapter is about the East Boston Tunnel. So that goes from Maverick Square in East Boston to into the city. At the time, there was a ferry, and I don't have it in the presentation. I don't think. Let's see. I don't have it. But there was a ferry that went back and forth from East Boston to Boston, and there was a photo of just people crammed on it. It was slow, so this made things go smoother. Underwater tunneling was pretty new as well. The Tube in London had built a tunnel under the Thames, so the people who were building Boston subway went to London and talked to the engineers there. But it was still a pretty tricky business. But they basically used the technology that was used in London, which was a shield. They had this thing called the Great Head Shield that they used to build the tube, and Boston employed a similar system. The coolest part is that they dug from two sides and met in the middle.
Wow.
And I don't understand math and triangulation very well, but I just like the fact that they could make measurements so accurately. I want to say they were off by like an inch and a half like that.
Mm-hmm.
So here, you can see these blocks was a airlock. They used compressed air inside the tunnel, and that kind of was like blowing air into a balloon, and it helped keep the walls supported, so it wasn't so heavy. It was dangerous. There was a blowout that I'll talk about that happened, I think, somewhere up in here. So there's the airlock. So basically the workers would go in, you could see some guy's feet here, and there's a phone, and there may be like a system of lights too, but basically you had to make sure the other door was closed before you opened that first one. But all the dirt came in and out of that. So if you can imagine, like, you know, all the dirt you had to excavate for both tunnels coming out of these airlocks must have been really time consuming. The workers also suffered from Caisson's disease. It's kind of like the bends when you're diving. So there's been, you know, sudden change in air pressure. That's a photograph from inside the tunnel. This is the shield. I'll show you how that works in a bit. And these are the supports for the tunnel. The earth carts, they loaded them, and then I'll show you the image of that in a minute. So here's the blowout. There was a section of soil that was loose. This was not under the river. I think this was under, like, near Aquarium Station. It's on the Boston side, and the road sunk a bit, but there was a loose part of the soil where the compressed air was used, and it sucked all the air, and with it, one of the workers got sucked up, and it took them a month to find the guy.
Well, his remains, that is.
Yeah, his remains.
Here in Carlisle.
So here's an image of construction. First thing was built these little sidewalls. This is the shield here. It's got some wheels so it can be pushed forward. It was pushed forward by hydraulic jacks. The back end of the shield is kind of like just an open sort of a little shell here. And they built the concrete under this section. So basically they have these steel girders here, and they put planks of wood over that, and then they pumped the concrete into that section. And once that was built, they moved it forward, and then just kept building these forward. And the last thing to be built was the floor. And that illustration was done from looking at these, and I just sort of made it three-dimensional. So here they're making the headings, the walls, here they are, and that thing's rolling on them. And let's see, I might have this out of order. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. So the tunnel, as it came under into the Boston side, came up State Street, and they built their station right under the old State House. You think of the old State House as like, you know, hallowed ground, Boston Massacre. But in 1880, the city of Chicago offered to buy the old State House and move it brick by brick from Boston to Chicago. And the Bostonian Society was formed in 1881 to preserve it, because it was really in disrepair. So there was, I guess, enough of a groundswell in 1880 to preserve it, but didn't save it from the station. But Washington Street is here. If you've been on the Orange Line, it goes right under Washington Street. It wasn't built yet, but it was being planned when they were building. This was, I think, 1903 it opened. This opened in 1905. They knew that the Orange Line was going to come through, and it's at the perfect junction of the two lines.
Opened in 1908. Sorry, I forgot to raise my hand.
Oh, that's 1908 for
The
which one?
Washington Street Tunnel.
1908. We'll have to talk about that. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. This is a couple bucks ago, so yeah, we'll check your facts after. So here's the old State House being demolished in part. They actually did a pretty good job with it. You know, if you go into State Street Station, the doors are here. You know, so there's not a lot. They're on the other side too, but I'm curious what the basement was like. What was in there. So I also wanted to show the moment that the two sides of the tunnel met. I just thought it'd be so cool. That's my brother and I. My wife Susan took the pictures of us like in the living room on the rug, just from the front and from the back. And then that's my Coleman Lantern, and I'm just thinking now that probably that's not so accurate, but I don't know, flames would have been good in that tunnel. Here's the day it opened, the newspaper, cartoon. Okay, I don't know these guys. I just found some pictures of people. So the red line went from Harvard to Andrews Square, Dorchester. I mean, it kept going, obviously, but for the time period it shows, to 1918. That's the route. Harvard boys. I guess Harvard's grown a little bit since then. So from Harvard to the river, it was just a cut and cover, same as the Green Line, what I've talked about in the past. This is the as you're coming from Kendall, MIT, up over the Longfellow. The Longfellow, now I'm like nervous about my dates, because I think the Longfellow was opened in 1906, something like that. This is 1909, this depicts 1909. In any case, the Longfellow was there a few years before the subway was built. So they knew it was coming, they designed the center section. So for a while, like a few years, the center section was there waiting for the subway trains to come over. And then you can see the silhouette of Beacon Hill in the background, so that's where we're heading. I love this photo because it tells a little bit about the, they didn't have these big trucks that they were driving these things on. They basically floated these beams down on barges, and they took them off the barges and, carried, one at a time to the site by a team of horses. I mean, it's just kind of cool. And it was built on time and on budget too. But these are, as you're coming over the Longfellow, approaching Charles MGH Station, they're still there. Those beams are still up there. They used the shield for Beacon Hill as well, but there was no compressed air. The soil was much firmer, so they just kind of used a shield without the air. So that would have been much easier to take the dirt out. When I was working on the book, we lived in a house right here in Beacon Hill. You could go on the roof and look down and see the subway going under. They actually destroyed a couple houses as this was But anyway, that's about the deepest part of the subway in the whole system. It's about 100 feet under Beacon Hill. And then you can see Park Street right now. On the right is only the Green Line. So up, for 10 years, 12 years, something in that range, it was Park Street Station was just Park Street. And then this became Park Street under for a while. The color system didn't come in for a while, so it was Park Street, the Green Line was Park Street, and the red line was Park Street under. And just like the Big Dig, you kind of had to work around, the city had to work as the Big Dig was going on. Same thing here. That Green Line, the Tremont Street subway was busy. Things were going, things were going. So they had to build that as things were going on above. They couldn't disrupt what was going on. This goes from Park to Downtown Crossing, and that couldn't be disrupted either, because that was the place to go shopping. It was like, before the mall, like everything was down at Downtown Crossing, so that had to function. So what they did was start the tunnel, they built the trench, and then covered it over, and then covered the whole road with wood, and then put tracks back over for the trolleys. And so as they were building the tunnel, everything was, people were walking on it, the trolleys were going over it. And I also snuck in, Elsie, who's now 12, was 1.5, I think, at the time. So that's her name there. And then my uncles are the Dirks, and they like golf, so all three of the kids got in the second book. So then you go down Winter Street to Summer Street to South Station. There's a short jog onto the 4-Point Channel on the way to Broadway, and then Broadway to Andrew. So unlike Downtown Crossing, Dorchester Ave was not as important. So the whole street was just construction, and they moved everything elsewhere. And then this last map is it's about one of the last pages of the book, or the last page, and it just shows the system now, which is in white, and then what I covered in the book. And I'll end with this. This is a sort of tribute to, these guys were called Sandhogs, the guys that built the subway. And that's it. So I'm open to questions. Try to answer them accurately.
How many people did they have working on,
Oh, I can't answer that. I don't know.
Thousands, I'm sure.
I did, people had asked about who built it, and I found, you would expect Italians and Irish, but I found that there were a ton of Lithuanians, which surprised me. Germans too, but Lithuania was surprised that was a big portion of the population. A lot. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And you had a question?
Oh, yeah, I'm just curious, the picture on the front, was
Mhm.
that, did you conceptualize that, or did you read news accounts, so they had?
Oh, this one, no, that was actually
that is
from
a
a photograph. That was
Okay,
straight up from a
okay,
photograph.
all right,
Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
And the photographs that I did just do a painting from, they were from, at the time, was Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, or SPNEA, which is now Historic New England, which is a much better name. And I asked them, they said, well, you can, it's a depiction of the I gave them a credit in the end. But anyway, yeah, there are some images straight from the internet. Yes, Dylan?
Did anyone ever fall off the train?
Yes, I'm sure they did. I can say yes, even though I don't have proof, but I'm sure they did. I'm sure people stuck out their arms and got them injured too. Yeah.
So what percentage of our current system was built in that first 20 years?
Well.
50%?
Well, you know what? A lot of the hard stuff was built. Because if you think about Riverside and Cleveland Circle and Boston College, those are all, above ground trolleys. So the tough stuff was done, back then, yeah, so a lot. A good percentage. I mean, in terms of the scale, and this isn't, is this the scale? This might be the scale. but I think just in terms of the technical stuff, like the East Boston Tunnel is still being used. There's still water that comes in there, but they have a pump pumping stuff out. But I mean, they soaked that tunnel with I think what they use tar-soaked felt as a water repellent. It works pretty well. Yep.
When did they abandon the Atlantic Street? Atlantic Ave?
Oh, the L? I don't know. I know the L went through the south end until '87 or something. And I don't know, maybe some of you people would know better than I when it was stopped on Atlantic. I don't know. I'm not sure. Usually, like, somebody pipes up because there's like, you know, I learned a ton from these kinds of things. Yeah.
Any number on, this was before OSHA, so any
Oh,
number-
about people hurt or
Any
killed?
hurt or killed, really.
I don't have that either. Yeah, I mean, the accounts I read about were like the people in the East Boston Tunnel that got sucked up. I think one was killed, like something hit him in the head, or he hit his head, and the other guy got like really, sucked up. There was an explosion on Tremont Street as well that killed, I think, 6 people. There was a leaking gas line, and they were, doing stuff, and they made a spark, and it was a huge explosion, and it, there were some horse-drawn carriages that were going over. So I think this was 1895 or 96 or something like that, and it killed a few horses, killed some people. The other thing that was interesting, doesn't have to do with people, but when the molasses flood happened, it destroyed a part of the elevated railway right here, Charlestown Bridge. There's some pictures of the tank just smashing the L and pushing it over. You have a question about that?
Was there much discussion as to where the tunnels would end and the trolleys would then come out of ground? Was that always easy to decide, or did they argue about that?
I don't remember anything about, from all I read, that the location on the public garden was always the place, but it does seem sort of an odd place, although where else would you put it, right? Because if you think about like Arlington, once you get to Arlington, you're on, you're into the streets and the buildings and stuff, so it kind of makes sense there. But there was definitely a lot of opposition. People didn't want to ruin the common was sort of sacred ground, and it's sort of like Central Park, don't touch it, and so there was definitely opposition to it. And then the North Station was just kind of logical because it's right there. Yeah.
What factors led to that Boston was the first? And
What led to
ahead of New York and some other places?
Well, because New York is
What
better
was that?
organized. New York one was better. It's gridded, and I think that from what I've read, Boston was just so congested because of the street layout. And other cities didn't have the stupid street layout that Boston had, just like meandering. And so, with other cities, I think there were options for those trolleys to spread out on some of the avenues. And then, New York, they had their L. So they built theirs in 1904 was their first subway system, and it was huge for the city. But yeah. Yeah.
I just didn't quite understand. You said under Beacon Hill, the ground was firmer, so it was
Yeah.
easier to cut into. It was easier. I didn't quite understand.
Well, I think there was less risk of collapse.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, because the soil underwater.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a historical organization that is kind of a repository of all of this? I mean, I'm imagining that there are like tours of the secret tunnels if you belong to this organization.
There used to be, but after 9/11, you couldn't get any anymore. And when I was researching this book, I was researching right around that time, and 9/11 happened, because you used to be able to get into the abandoned tunnels, and you can't anymore. So, but Frank Chaney is the guy. I mean, there's people who love trolleys, and he's up at the Seashore Trolley Museum. He's involved in that. Then there's also the Boston Transit Museum, which is downtown. And the guy that, when I was researching this, I'm blanking on his name, but he was incredible. I went there and he would tell me, I couldn't leave. Because he would get me and he would love talking. I learned a ton. But he since passed away, and he had all this stuff in his head. But Frank Chaney would be the guy. And
There are a lot of photographs, old photographs of the.
yeah, Historic New England has a ton. But really the best resource for the subway is the books, the Boston Transit Commission books. They're about this big, and they're blue, and they start in 1894. And they had pretty much like 90% full collection. So you could take these books, 1894, the report from 1895, 1896, 1897, you open them up and you have everything you want to know about construction, about everything. And those are in the Boston Transit Massachusetts Transportation Library.
It was the same company that did the whole system. Because New York, you know, they were all independent
Right,
subway systems.
right, it's not like that,
Brooklyn,
yeah.
Different ones.
Yep. Yeah, this is the Boston Elevated Railway Company.
Yeah, there are a couple Facebook pages for the MBTA throughout the years group.
Okay.
You can join them. You have to be invited by someone that you know.
You have to be vetted.
But they quite often will post historical photos of what the old subway looked like. With
Oh, cool.
Gal and
Okay.
stuff. It's really, and they don't send out a lot of stuff, so it's not
Yeah.
annoying either. So.
There's a good site, I think, that might be on Facebook too, that's called Dirty Old Boston.
Right.
And it's got old pictures of all kinds of old, like a lot of old, 70s, 40s. That's pretty good. Yep.
You mentioned something about an entrance that you could see from where Pleasant Street went in. You
Yeah.
could see the old entrance.
So I showed that train, the orange line, the orange elevated train. If you're at Boylston, if you go from Park to Boylston to Arlington, and you get in the first car, and you can watch where you can see through the glass beyond the conductor. You might even see it from the side. As you go right to turn towards Arlington, you can see a tunnel going straight. That's yeah. And I had really wanted to get in there. And they thought about, when they were building the Silver Line, I think they had talked about doing a light rail to Dudley Square, just like a train, a trolley, and they were gonna reopen that tunnel, but it never happened.
How far does it go there?
What's that?
How far does it go, the Atlantica?
I think it's like a mile. Goes to the south end. If anyone's interested, I won't keep everybody, but I have some originals up here, so there's not a lot of room, but I'm happy to have you guys come up and take a look. Does anyone have any more questions? I don't wanna. Yeah?
Your readings, looking at the Boston Post and all of that, from a reliability standpoint, did they talk about that?
Reliability?
Yes.
You mean like snowstorms?
Yes.
I don't know.
Now, in a comparison perspective, what the expectations were, what the reality was versus now.
I don't know, that's a good question.
It's theoretically flawed, so is there any, can you say anything about all that research and reading you did that can compare to then and now, and what people expected to get across town, and were they at work or wherever they were going on time? Those signals not working, and that's what happened.
I don't remember reading a lot of stuff about that.
So they didn't really talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard. Now it's really great researching because you can go to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and type in a keyword, and every article with that keyword will pop up. But when I was researching this, I would go 1890, September 1st, 1897, I would go to the microfilm and go to September 2nd, and I would read everything, and then I would find key dates, and I would go and read all that stuff, just to get the first-hand accounts. But that kind of stuff is the stuff you wouldn't have on those big dates. It would be just the in-between. So I didn't really get into that. Yeah. And then I guess there was that 1938 was the big hurricane, right? And then 78 was a blizzard. Those would be the ones to look at. Maybe you could go to the date after that and see, I don't know. All right, well, did you have? Yeah.
What about the stories of people who were afraid to get into the subway because it was under microbe that you described.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little about that?
I did. Well, I think I'm sure there were some people who refused to go in. You know, I remember Menino's wife won't go over the Tobin Bridge. Is that Tobin Bridge, right? That goes to Like, yeah, she won't go over the Tobin. So I'm sure like there's some people who even with like the lights and all the paint still wouldn't go in. But I think once the thing started running and people saw that they weren't getting, you know, it's funny, when New York subway was built, they had, within the tunnel, they had these lights in the tunnel to light it. And they said that if you were in the trolley passing the lights and you stared at them, you could get some eye disease by staring at the lights as you were passing through the subway. Like all these, but and I think once people start using it, and I didn't see a lot come up after that.
Why are you attracted to these topics like this and then Times Square?
For me, I think it's about the passage of time. Like, I'm going through these tunnels that seem like modern tunnels, like everyone's going to work, it's sort of a modern day thing. But to think, if you're in Park Street and you're looking up, those tunnels are the same, those steel beams are the same, those bricks are the same that were there, you know, in 1897, and it's kind of fun to think about, you know, about that. My next book is about geology, so it's sort of millions of years, but it's the same kind of thing, is about like kind of finding a fossil and imagining that history of the fossil. So I've found that the subjects I'm attracted to are about time passing.
You mentioned a transit museum.
Yeah.
Where was that and what's there?
Kennebunk, Maine. Well, Kennebunk, Maine
Oh, I think
has...
they were in Boston.
It's Boston. Well, it's really just the New England, what do they call it now? New England Antiquities? I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, Historical New England, thank you. They have all the photographs. It's not specifically subway. The Transit Library's got some stuff, but like, you know, Brooklyn has an incredible museum. It's fantastic for the subway in New York. Boston just doesn't have that. So the closest we have is Kennebunk, Maine, where they have like the trolleys and that kind of stuff.
National Historic Society has anything like that?
I don't think there's anything subway focused. It would be nice. I mean, the picture that I took of that trolley sitting in the, it's awful. It's like, they don't even go in there to clean it or clean the walls or repaint the walls. It wouldn't. And yeah.
They have a few old cars at the Boylston stop.
Yeah, those two, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have like a cable car museum. Like
Yeah. We need a Lars Anderson auto museum for trains. Yep.
I can't see too clearly from here, but wasn't there a Watertown line on the Green Line?
Yeah.
It went up right now?
Oh, did I not put it in?
It went on Com Ave and then split off at Brighton Ave.
Oh, maybe.
Up to St. Elizabeth's.
Maybe it's not a complete map.
Yeah.
There were tracks there for a long time.
I think it was it.
So it was the A line, right?
Yeah.
It was around in the 70s, and when I moved back in 2006, it's a traffic island now at night. I went over those tracks in my motorcycle many times.
Oh.
So I knew it was there.
Of course, the fascinating thing is that these subway lines connected to the interurban lines, and you could take an electric railway all the way to New Hampshire and Maine. It's just it's an incredible network.
Yeah. Yes. It was cheap too. It was a nickel. It was a nickel for 25 years.
That's not gonna happen now.
No. $2.65. Okay. Well, thank you.